The crimson sun hung low over the Pacific as Admiral Koichi Nagamo stood on the bridge of the carrier Akagi, watching his massive fleet cut through the dark waters toward Midway Atoll. Behind him stretched the most formidable naval armada Japan had ever assembled: 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, all bearing the weight of the emperor's ambitions and 6 months of unbroken victory. Nagumo's weathered hands gripped the ship's rail as he surveyed his domain. The Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, these floating fortresses had carved a path of destruction across the Pacific since the attack on Pearl Harbor. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to the Coral Sea, Japanese naval aviation had proven itself superior to anything the Americans could muster. The very mention of these carrier names struck fear into Allied hearts, and rightfully so. The admiral's confidence was not misplaced. His pilots were veterans of China, hardened by years of combat and trained to a razor's edge. They had perfected the art of coordinated carrier strikes, turning their ships into instruments of precision warfare that could appear anywhere in the vast Pacific and delivered devastating blows before vanishing like ghosts. The Americans, by contrast, seemed perpetually caught off guard, their forces scattered and demoralized after months of humiliating defeats. Captain Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, approached with the latest intelligence reports. "Admiral, our reconnaissance confirms Midway's defenses remain modest. A few dozen aircraft, mostly obsolete fighters and bombers. Their Pacific fleet appears to be scattered across Hawaiian waters, still licking their wounds from our previous victories." Nagumo nodded with satisfaction. Operation A represented more than just another tactical victory. It was the key to Japan's grand strategy in the Pacific. By seizing Midway, they would establish an unsinkable aircraft carrier just over 1,000 miles from Pearl Harbor, close enough to threaten Hawaii itself and force the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle on Japanese terms. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and mastermind of Japan's Pacific campaign, had chosen this target with characteristic brilliance. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Nagumo's carriers would soften Midway's defenses with devastating airstrikes, clearing the way for Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo's invasion force to land troops and establish permanent control. Meanwhile, the combined fleet's battleships, led by Yamamoto himself aboard the mighty Yamato, would position themselves to intercept and destroy any American naval forces foolish enough to challenge Japanese supremacy. As night fell over the task force, Nagumo reflected on the transformation of Japanese naval power. Just 70 years earlier, Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships had forced Japan to abandon its isolation, revealing the nation's military weakness to the world. Now those same waters carried Japanese warships that had humbled the British at Singapore, the Dutch in Java, and the Americans at Pearl Harbor. The student had become the master, and tomorrow would provide yet another demonstration of Japanese superiority. Below decks, mechanics made final preparations on the Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi Val dive bombers that would spearhead tomorrow's assault. Pilots gathered around intelligence briefings, studying photographs of Midway's installations with the methodical precision that had made them the terror of the Pacific. Everything was proceeding according to plan, just as it had for 6 glorious months of uninterrupted conquest. Commander Joseph Rochefort, hunched over his desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor, surrounded by intercepted Japanese radio transmissions and the acrid smell of cigarette smoke. For weeks, his cryptanalysts had been breaking Japanese naval codes, piece by piece, revealing the outlines of a massive operation targeting a F. Through careful deception, they had confirmed that a F meant Midway, and now Rochefort held in his hands the complete Japanese battle plan. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had gambled everything on Rochefort's intelligence. Despite having only 3 operational aircraft carriers against Nagumo's 4, Nimitz had positioned his forces in a carefully laid ambush northeast of Midway. The Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and they hastily repaired. Yorktown, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, waited in the pre-dawn darkness, like hunters preparing to spring their trap. According to historical accounts from the Naval War College's analysis of the battle, American forces faced overwhelming odds, with Japanese pilots averaging over 600 hours of combat experience, compared to barely 50 hours for many American aviators. Yet what the Japanese didn't know was that their every move had been anticipated, their secret codes broken, their element of surprise transformed into a fatal vulnerability. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the Pacific horizon, Nagumo's carriers began launching their initial strike against Midway. 108 aircraft, 36 Cape bombers, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters rose from the 4 carrier decks in perfect formation, their engines creating a thunderous symphony of impending destruction. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the strike, confident that within hours Midway would be reduced to smoking rubble. But on Midway itself, radar operators had detected the incoming formation while it was still 150 miles away. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as every available American aircraft scrambled to meet the threat. Marine Corps pilots in their obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats climbed desperately toward the approaching storm, knowing they were outclassed but determined to sell their lives dearly. The sky above Midway exploded into chaos as Japanese Zeros tore through the American defensive formations with ruthless efficiency. Captain Marion Carl and Major John Smith led their Marines in a hopeless but heroic charge against overwhelming odds, their outdated fighters no match for the superior Japanese aircraft. Within minutes, 15 of 25 Marine fighters had been shot down, their pilots' sacrifice buying precious time for Midway's defenders. Below, anti-aircraft guns opened fire as Tominaga's bombers swept over the atoll. Explosions erupted across the tiny island as fuel tanks burst into flame and buildings collapsed under the bombardment. Yet despite the apparent devastation, Midway's airfield remained operational, its runways scarred, but still functional. More critically, the American radar station continued operating, its operators tracking every Japanese movement and relaying vital intelligence to Fletcher's task force. As Tominaga's aircraft returned to their carriers, the Japanese strike leader radioed a message that would prove fateful. There is need for a second attack wave. Nagumo faced a crucial decision. His aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for attacking American ships, but a second strike on Midway would require high-explosive bombs more suitable for land targets. The switch would take precious time, leaving his carriers temporarily vulnerable. Unknown to Nagumo, American torpedo bombers from Midway had already launched their own desperate attack against his task force. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney led 16 Army Air Force's Boeing B-26 Marauders in a low-level assault that achieved complete surprise. Though none of their torpedoes found their marks, the attack convinced Nagumo that Midway's defenses remained dangerously intact, reinforcing his decision to prepare for a second strike. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron gripped the controls of his Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber as Torpedo Squadron 8 climbed away from the Hornet's flight deck. Behind him, 14 more antiquated aircraft struggled to maintain formation, their crews knowing they were flying what many considered a suicide mission. The Devastator was slow, cumbersome, and virtually defenseless, a flying coffin against the Japanese Zero fighters that had dominated every air battle for 6 months. Waldron had studied Japanese tactics obsessively, understanding better than most the odds his squadron faced. His aircraft carried the Navy's troubled Mark 13 torpedo, a weapon so unreliable that many hits would fail to explode. Yet he also understood the strategic importance of this moment. If American torpedo bombers could reach Nagumo's carriers, While their flight decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, a single successful attack might achieve what months of defensive fighting had failed to accomplish. The attack plan called for coordinated strikes from all three American carriers, with fighters providing cover for the vulnerable torpedo bombers, while dive bombers attacked from high altitude. But in the confusion of launching from widely separated positions, the American formations became scattered across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Communication failures and navigation errors left each squadron fighting alone, without the mutual support that might have ensured success. Spruance's Task Force 16 had launched first, sending 37 Devastators, 67 Dauntless dive bombers, and 20 Wildcat fighters toward the last known position of the Japanese fleet. But Nagumo's carriers had changed course, turning north to close the distance to Midway for their planned second strike. Most American aircraft flew toward empty ocean while precious fuel burned away in their tanks. Waldron's Torpedo 8 was first to locate the enemy. At 9:30 in the morning, the distinctive silhouettes of Japanese carriers appeared on the horizon, surrounded by their protective screen of destroyers and cruisers. The Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu steamed in. Perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being hastily rearmed for the second Midway strike. It was exactly the target American planners had hoped for, if they could reach it. Attack immediately, Waldron radioed to his squadron, knowing that every second of delay allowed more Japanese fighters to reach altitude. The 15 Devastators began their torpedo runs, skimming just above the wave tops at barely 120 miles per hour. They made perfect targets for the swarming Zeros that dove from above like hawks attacking field mice. Lieutenant Commander Shigematsu Sakeda led the Japanese fighter response, his experienced pilots methodically shooting down the American torpedo bombers one by one. The obsolete Devastators had neither the speed to escape nor the defensive armament to fight back effectively. Within minutes, 14 of 15 aircraft from Torpedo 8 had been destroyed, their crews perishing in the Pacific swells. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket and watching the battle unfold from the water. But Waldron's sacrifice was not in vain. The torpedo attack had drawn every available Japanese fighter down to sea level, leaving the upper altitudes temporarily undefended. More critically, the constant maneuvering to avoid torpedo attacks had disrupted the careful timing of Japanese flight operations, creating delays that would prove catastrophic. Commander Eugene Lindsay's Torpedo 6 from the Enterprise suffered a similar fate, losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a single hit. Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey's Torpedo 3 from the Yorktown met the same bloody reception, with 12 of 13 Devastators shot down in flames. In 30 minutes of savage fighting, American torpedo squadrons had been virtually annihilated, achieving nothing more than slight damage to a single Japanese destroyer. Yet their heroic sacrifice had created the conditions for an American miracle. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled high above the empty Pacific, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels as he searched for the Japanese fleet. Leading 37 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, McCluskey had been flying for nearly 2 hours without finding his target. Below him, the ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, offering no clue to the enemy's location. McClu Sky faced an agonizing decision. His aircraft were approaching the point of no return soon. They would lack sufficient fuel to reach their carriers, even if they abandoned the search immediately. Standard doctrine called for turning back, preserving his squadron for another day. But McCluskey understood the strategic implications of this moment. If Nagumo's carriers escaped unscathed, they would likely complete their conquest of Midway and continue their seemingly unstoppable advance across the Pacific. At 10:20 a.m., McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, its wake creating a white arrow pointing toward the enemy fleet. The ship was the Arashi, which had been dropping depth charges on an American submarine and was now hurrying to rejoin Nagumo's formation. Following this providential guide, McCluskey's bombers finally located their target 4 Japanese aircraft. Carriers steaming in a protective box formation, their flight decks crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. The scene below represented the perfect target for dive bombing attack. Nagumo's carriers were in the midst of their most vulnerable moment, caught between preparing for a second strike on Midway and rearming to meet the American naval threat. The Akagi and Kaga had aircraft spotted on their flight decks, bombs and torpedoes scattered across the wooden planking, while fuel hoses snaked between parked planes. A single well-placed bomb could trigger a chain reaction that would destroy an entire carrier. McClu Sky divided his force, leading one section against the Kaga, while Lieutenant Richard Best took his 3-plane section after the flagship Akagi. At 10:24 a.m., the dauntless dive bombers rolled into their attacks, screaming down from 14,000 feet at nearly vertical angles. The Japanese, still focused on the torpedo attacks at sea level, were caught completely by surprise. Lieutenant Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck the Akagi just behind the amidships elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the upper hangar among the armed and fueled aircraft waiting for launch. The blast ignited aviation gasoline and set off secondary explosions that quickly spread throughout the ship. Within minutes, the flagship of the Pearl Harbor attack force was transformed into a raging inferno. McCluskey's bombers achieved similar success against the Kaga, landing multiple hits that turned the massive carrier into a floating funeral pyre. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from the Yorktown, arriving almost simultaneously, struck the Soryu with devastating effect. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 premier aircraft carriers had been mortally wounded. Explosions were visible for miles as aviation fuel and ordnance created towering pillars of flame and smoke. Aboard the burning carriers, damage control parties fought desperately to contain fires that seemed to spread faster than they could be extinguished. The wooden flight decks, soaked with gasoline and littered with high explosives, had become death traps for the crews trapped below. Captain Tajiro Aoki of the Kaga watched helplessly as his ship was consumed by flames that reached temperatures hot enough to warp steel plating. The crew's heroic efforts to save their vessel were doomed from the start too. Much flammable material had been ignited simultaneously for any human effort to prevail. Similar scenes played out aboard the Akagi and Soryu as Japan's most experienced naval aviators perished in the flames or abandoned ship into the oil-slicked waters. In 5 minutes of precision bombing, American naval aviation had achieved what 6 months of Japanese victories had made seem impossible. The myth of Japanese invincibility lay in ruins. Burning on the Pacific swells, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on the bridge of the burning Soryu, refusing all pleas from his officers to abandon ship. The veteran commander had served the Imperial Navy for over 30 years, rising through the ranks to command one of Japan's most prestigious carriers. Now as flames consumed his vessel and explosions echoed through her hull, Yanagimoto chose to follow the ancient tradition of going down with his ship rather than face the shame of survival. Throughout the Japanese task force, similar scenes of devastation unfolded as 3 of the 4 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor burned beyond salvation. The Akagi, flagship of the 1st Air Fleet, listed heavily to port as fires spread through her hangar decks. Admiral Nagumo, forced to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Nagara, watched in stunned disbelief as his seemingly invincible force disintegrated before his eyes. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of Japan's most experienced pilots and aircrew, the veterans who had perfected carrier aviation through years of combat in China and months of victory across the Pacific, perished in the flames or struggled in the oil-covered waters. These irreplaceable men had represented the core of Japanese naval aviation, their skills honed through thousands of hours of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. Yet, One Japanese carrier remained operational. The Hiryu, separated from her sister ships during the morning's chaotic maneuvering, had escaped the American dive bombing attack. Her captain, Tomio Kaku, and Air Group Commander, Lieutenant Commander Takashiji Igusa, immediately began preparing a counterattack against the American fleet. If they could sink even one American carrier, the battle might still be salvaged from complete disaster. At 10:54 a.m., 18 naval dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters launched from the Hiryu's deck, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. Their target was the Yorktown, which Japanese reconnaissance had identified as the nearest American carrier. The strike represented the concentrated fury of a proud navy, determined to exact revenge for the morning's catastrophic losses. The Yorktown's radar detected the incoming attack at a range of 46 miles, providing precious minutes for preparation. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered his ship to general quarters as damage control parties took their positions and anti-aircraft guns swung toward the threatening sky. Fighter aircraft launched from the carrier's deck while others landed to refuel and rearm, creating a desperate ballet of organized chaos. At 12:10 p.m., Kobayashi's dive bombers began their attack, screaming down through a wall of anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with deadly shrapnel. The Yorktown's gunners, trained through months of combat in the Coral Sea, put up a fierce defense that shot down several Japanese aircraft. But enough bombers penetrated the defensive screen to score 3 direct hits on the American carrier. First bomb struck near the island structure, destroying the radar equipment and killing many of the ship's senior officers. The second penetrated deep into the ship's interior, starting fires in the rag storage compartments that threatened to spread throughout the vessel. The third bomb damaged the flight deck and temporarily disabled the carrier's ability to launch or recover aircraft. Yet the Yorktown's damage control parties, trained to a level of efficiency that would have impressed their Japanese counterparts, worked miracles of repair. Within 2 hours they had the fires under control, the flight deck patched, and the ship capable of launching aircraft once again. The carrier's survival seemed to demonstrate American resilience in the face of seemingly overwhelming damage. But the Hiryu was not finished. At 1:30 p.m., a second strike wave departed the Japanese carrier, 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros, led by Lieutenant Tominaga, the same officer who had led the morning attack on Midway. These aircraft carried the 18-inch Type 91 torpedoes that had proven so devastatingly effective at Pearl Harbor, weapons capable of breaking the carrier's back with a single well-placed hit. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga checked his fuel gauge one final time as his formation of torpedo bombers approached the American task force. His aircraft had been damaged during the morning strike on Midway, its fuel tank punctured by defensive fire, leaving him with barely enough gasoline for a one-way mission. Yet Tominaga pressed forward, understanding that this might be Japan's last opportunity to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the mobile force. The 10 Kate torpedo bombers skimmed across the wavetops at maximum speed, their crews knowing they faced a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire from not just the Yorktown but her protective screen of cruisers and destroyers. American fighter pilots dove from above, their machine guns chattering as they tried to break up the attack formation before it could reach the carrier. At 2:44 p.m., despite the fierce defensive fire, 4 Japanese torpedoes found their mark against the Yorktown's port side. The explosions ruptured fuel tanks and flooded the engine rooms, leaving the great ship dead in the water and listing heavily. This time, the damage proved beyond the capabilities of even the most skillful repair crews. Captain Buckmaster reluctantly gave the order to abandon ship, and within minutes, 3,000 officers and men were sliding down lines into the Pacific swells. Tominaga's aircraft never returned to the Hiryu. The gallant pilot, following the samurai code that demanded death before dishonor, had crashed his damaged bomber into the sea after completing his final mission. His sacrifice epitomized the desperate courage with which Japanese naval aviators fought even as their cause became hopeless. But American forces were already preparing their response. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, the dive bomber, leader whose morning attack had crippled 3 Japanese carriers, was refueling and rearming his surviving Dauntless aircraft aboard the Enterprise. Intelligence reports had located the Hiryu, the last operational enemy carrier, steaming alone and vulnerable approximately 100 miles northwest of the American task force. At 3:30 p.m., 24 Dauntless dive bombers launched from the Enterprise and Hornet, led by Lieutenant Earl Gallagher. Their mission was simple: find and destroy the final Japanese carrier before it could launch additional strikes against the American fleet. The pilots understood that failure might allow the Hiryu to escape and continue the war with her experienced air group intact. The attack came at 5 p.m., just as the Hiryu was preparing to launch a third strike against the American carriers. Lieutenant Commander Takashiji Igusa was spotting his remaining aircraft on the flight deck when American dive bombers appeared overhead like avenging angels. The Japanese carrier's anti-aircraft guns opened fire desperately, but they lacked the concentrated firepower that had protected the morning formation. 4 direct hits transformed the Hiryu into a blazing wreck within minutes. The explosions, amplified by aviation gasoline and armed aircraft on the flight deck, created an inferno that quickly spread throughout the ship. Captain Kaku and Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander of the 2nd Carrier Division, chose to go down with their vessel rather than survive the destruction of their command. As darkness fell over the Pacific battlefield, all 4 Japanese carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were either sunk or burning wrecks awaiting their final plunge to the ocean floor. The mobile force that had seemed invincible that morning lay shattered, its aircraft destroyed, its irreplaceable aircrew dead or scattered across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. The Battle of Midway was effectively over. Though scattered fighting would continue for another day as Japanese surface forces attempted futile attacks and American submarines hunted the retreating enemy fleet, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of the battleship Yamato, staring eastward toward the smoke-darkened horizon where his carriers had met their doom. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had warned that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months to a year, now faced the bitter confirmation of his own prophecy. The time of easy victories was over, and the industrial might of America was beginning to assert itself with devastating effectiveness. The statistics were staggering in their implications. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and most critically, over 3,000 experienced officers and men. Among the dead were some of the finest naval aviators in the world, pilots whose skills had been honed through years of training and combat experience that the Empire could not quickly replace. The surviving Japanese forces, scattered and demoralized, were already beginning their long retreat toward home waters. American losses, while significant, were manageable. The Yorktown would eventually be sunk by a Japanese submarine while under tow, and 147 aircraft had been destroyed in the fighting. But 307 officers and men had been lost, a fraction of Japanese casualties. More importantly, the American industrial machine was already producing replacement carriers, aircraft, and pilots at a rate that Japan could never match. Admiral Nimitz, monitoring the battle from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, understood immediately that Midway represented more than just a tactical victory. The mystique of Japanese invincibility had been shattered, proof that American forces could meet and defeat the Emperor's finest on equal terms. The psychological impact would resonate throughout the Pacific, giving hope to Allied forces and doubt to Japanese commanders who had grown accustomed to easy conquest. According to declassified documents from the Naval Historical Center, Japanese naval leadership recognized the strategic implications. Immediately, The mobile force had been the spearhead of Japanese expansion, the instrument that had enabled rapid conquest across thousands of miles of Pacific territory. Without those carriers and their experienced air groups, Japan's ability to project power was fatally compromised. The human stories emerging from the battle would become legend. Ensign George Gay, sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, was rescued after 30 hours in the water, his testimony providing valuable intelligence about Japanese defensive tactics. The heroism of pilots like John Waldron and Wade McCluskey would inspire a generation of American naval aviators. Even Japanese officers like Captain Yanagimoto, who chose death over surrender, earned respect from their enemies for their courage in defeat. As dawn broke over the Pacific on June 5th, Yamamoto faced the most difficult decision of his career. His surface fleet still possessed overwhelming firepower, led by the massive Yamato with her 18-inch guns. A night attack against the American carriers might yet achieve some measure of revenge. But without air cover, his battleships would be vulnerable to continuous air attack throughout the following day. The risks outweighed any potential gains. At 2:55 a.m., Yamamoto issued the order that sealed Japan's fate in the Pacific. Occupying force and mobile force will withdraw. The dreams of conquering Midway, of threatening Hawaii, of forcing America to negotiate a compromise peace, died with those words. Japan would spend the remainder of the war fighting an increasingly desperate defensive campaign against an enemy whose industrial capacity was just beginning to reach full production. The Battle of Midway had lasted barely 3 days, but its consequences would shape the remainder of World War II. Japanese naval aviation never recovered from the losses suffered in those crucial hours of June 4th. The initiative in the Pacific passed permanently to American forces, who would use it to begin the long, bloody advance toward the Japanese home islands. In Tokyo, the defeat was so catastrophic that military censors suppressed all news of the battle. Families of the fallen were told their loved ones had died heroically in a great victory. But within the highest circles of Japanese leadership, Midway's implications were understood with crystal clarity. The war Japan had started at Pearl Harbor would now be fought on American terms, with American advantages, until the rising sun finally set over the ruins of the empire. The tide of war had turned forever, and Japanese naval pride lay shattered on the bottom of the Pacific, alongside the carriers that had once ruled its waves.